Thank you so much for sharing that beautiful garden space with us. And right now we're going to be turning our attention to the plants and landscapes of the desert Southwest and how to appropriately react to our own climate here in Austin, Texas. And we're really thrilled to have joining us David Cristiani, who's from Albuquerque on the program. David is a landscape designer, and his firm in Albuquerque is called Quercus, which is the Latin for oak. It is one of my favorite species. So it's great to have you on the program.
Well, thanks. Nice to meet you.
And nice to meet you too. And you know, our topic today is going to be an interesting one. I'm looking forward to this conversation because you really want to focus in on some of the frustrations that some of the people have with their landscapes, and maybe you're reacting in the wrong way. There might be a more appropriate way to respond to, for example, the kind of drought situations that we here in Central Texas have experienced in the past few years.
I think so. And I think part of these lessons come from the desert Southwest, and I'd hate to see a place that has its own unique ecology and look try to look like a place it's not. I'd hate to see Austin turn into Tucson, because you'll find out during a wet period it's not Tucson.
Exactly.
And your dry periods are only our average periods out west.
Right, and I think that's, you know, I think you hit the nail on the head is, that we have to be appropriate to our space. And Austin has traditionally sat on that meridian line where between the well-watered east and the west, the line seems to fluctuate from one year to the next, but it comes back. And we may have 9 inches of rain one year, but 55 inches the next.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the keys of being on the prairie. You're in the central prairie of the United States, but in Texas, especially this latitude further south, 30 degrees, you are closer to a desert area and closer to the southeastern forests than you typically would be on prairie. If you go north in Kansas, the distance is a few hundred miles more every direction.
Right.
But not down here, and I think you need to respond, but the native landscapes here have always responded, and we need to take our cues from nature, the patterns and the processes in nature.
Right. Well, one of the ways that people have overreacted, in your estimation, and certainly we can see it all around the city, is to get extreme about removal of things like turf and green leafy plants, and replacing them sometimes with appropriate, sometimes inappropriate plants, but often sometimes just with rock.
Yeah, and we've been doing it longer than anybody in the Southwest and Western United States, and a lawn is a collection of plants, and to go from that to a collection of aggregate and rock is really extreme. That's 180 degrees.
Literally 180 degrees Fahrenheit, right?
Yeah, just about.
Yeah, you get that reflected heat. It can make for a miserable space.
And I don't think it's necessary, because where I am, there are plants in that space. The driest place I work at regularly is Las Vegas, Nevada, 3.5, 4.5 inches of rain a year. And there's still a plant density of 10–20%. That's more than most gravel scapes I see have.
Right,
And a lot of those are shrubs, so they're large enough, they look like they cover more than that. But if you look at them from the air, you can see they're thin.
Right.
Austin is far from Las Vegas as far as climate and vegetation density.
Right. So let's talk about gravelscapes for a minute here, because that has been a roaring trend in our community. I've seen many conversions in the past few years, and actually in my last garden, I use a tremendous amount of gravel myself. But there are some good things to be said about the use of gravel, obviously, but then there are a lot of drawbacks that people don't consider. For example, the most commonly used granite or gravel material in our area is granite, and weeds just love growing in it. So people are unprepared for that, number one. And then there are, but the heat's another factor, and any other downsides to that you want to point out?
Well, you mentioned the weeds, and that is always a problem. It can also be if you have plants that you desire that also reseed in it, that can be a positive. But with the weeds, you do have to eliminate the weeds beforehand. You can use everything from cardboard layering if you have some time on your hands. Sometimes you have to use chemicals. But that's the important part, and the depth of it is also important. In what you're going to be using that gravel for. But I think the downside is treating the gravel as a wholesale replacement for lawn. And it's not. They're two different things. Gravel, would be like the throw rug or the carpet or the tile in the house, but it wouldn't be an interesting house without furniture,
Okay.
without accessories, and
Good
I think
metaphor,
that's what's
yeah.
lacking. And the furniture or the mass are the
Right.
places that you can sit and enjoy that habitat you've created. Plants are part of that.
Right, and I think a critical thing in that is the comfort level too. And you consider we may be on that dividing line between wet and dry, but we are firmly implanted in the hot.
That's right.
And if you want to make your garden completely inaccessible, really, for 8 months a year, then make it out of gravel, basically.
I fully agree.
Yeah.
I fully agree. One of the thoughts about gravel, if it's implemented correctly, is it is a permeable surface, so that's better than concrete.
Sure.
Which is what we do a lot of patios in the desert Southwest, and we just don't use them in the middle of the day, but we use them at night.
Sure.
Where I am, it cools down at night, even though it becomes an inferno by 9 in the morning every summer. But we can use those patios if we put shade, we build a shade structure, shade
Sure.
ramada, and I think that's one of the keys, but concrete is not very permeable, gravel is. So now you're creating a better environment for the plantings than you would if you just had complete concrete over the area.
Sure, sure. Now, another technique or that people need to be thinking about, and this is something I know that is important to you, is kind of gathering plants together in zones and thinking of the like mini ecosystems within a single property.
Okay, I first would start at the big picture, the ecological model, and where you are here is on the prairie. You have different types of prairie. You have woodland, you have areas that are tall grass on the blackland,
Right.
you have cross timbers and a few other things. And I tend to look at it very simply. These areas have taken the extremes of Austin rainfall over, the eons, not just 30 years or 100 years.
Right.
And you tend to almost always see high water plants in the low areas that collect water, low water plants in the high areas, and those low water plants are spaced out further from each other than the high water plants in the low areas.
Sure.
And I think we need to treat our grades on our properties the same way, whether it's a huge property, whether it's a small residential courtyard. We're always going to solve problems, and how we solve the problem is the cue. We always want to move water away from a structure so we don't create more problems, the least of which are more insects.
Sure.
The most is getting water inside the house during a rainy period. There's your opportunity. Now you're taking water and you're moving it away from the structure. That needs to be moved to an area that some of that water can seep into the ground for the higher water plants. And your lower water plants are either near the house or you have a patio there.
Sure.
And further back where that water isn't getting to yet.
It's really all about the design and the visualization before you start just putting plants in the ground. And thinking about
correct.
the grade is critical. And a lot of folks here, of course, live on hillsides. So thinking about that, keeping that in mind. There's also, another side that we need to be thinking about, and this is something I know you're a big advocate of, which is rainwater harvesting and things like that, more appropriate ways of thinking about how we use the water we have.
And that ties in right with my point, where we determine where the water should go, not necessarily where it is going, but where it should go. Older homes have often settled, and they create a low area around the home, and that's your first cue. You need to move that water away, so you do have to do some minor grading. You have to watch out for tree roots, of course. But one of the things I think goes into this, the plant patterns, is abstracting something. Now, we in the Southwest desert can see 90 miles. How are you going to abstract that view down to a small area? And that's the key, is to take cues from the architecture.
Or take cues from the ecosystem,
And the ecosystem.
that we have. And I know that we could spend a long time visiting about this, David, but we really do appreciate you coming on board. And I love your point that Austin is not Tucson yet. And we need to bear that in mind. So thank you for being our guest.
Thank you.
All right, and coming up next is our friend Daphne.